Welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in while we are waiting for everyone to trickle in and fire up their machines. It's been a while since we did a TheyDo webinar, since I did a TheyDo webinar. And I'm excited to be back at the helm live. For those who know, we started a podcast called The Experience Edge, which are wonderful conversations, but they are not live. And today we are doing a live one. So that's going to be exciting. So I'm going to give it one more second, a few more seconds for everyone to trickle in before we get going. And it's going to be a good one. I'm excited for today. And if you see, we have a new platform. Typically, we are in Zoom, but we have some new tech, and we're going to test it out all together. So thank you for bearing with us. As you can see, there's a chat, and if you can open it and say your name and where you're from, that will be wonderful to see who we have here today. So please put your name and where you're from in the chat. My name is Jochem. I am from Amsterdam. My guest, who I'll introduce properly soon, is Zack. Zack, where are you from?
I am from the great state of Indiana here in the United States.
Very nice. So we got Josie Ann from Quebec, Canada, QC. And we got Michael, we got Mary from New Hampshire, we got Moritz from Spain, we got Charlotta from Spain. Nice, thank you. Good to see you. We got Gabrielle from Argentina, Hanneke, fellow Dutch citizen, that's nice. Mikael from Denmark, so many people from around the world. We got global coverage. Let's see if someone is in Asia today to truly make that official, but let's see. At least we are in many different countries. So thank you. I see the chat is working. So again, we have some new tech, so bear with us. We'll do some polling at the end. It's going to be fun. But let's get started. So today we're going to talk about the CX goldmine in retail. And who better to do this with than Zack Hamilton? And if you don't know who he is, I'll do a quick intro. I'm sure some of you know him or have seen him, but today he's the Senior Vice President at Parcel Lab, heading up growth strategy and enablement. But most of you know him from his newsletter, or could know him from his newsletter or podcast today, and his brand called Unpack Your CX. That's right. We're calling it out. We might want to bleep it out in the post-production of this, but we did it live anyway. But he is here because of his background in retail. He's seen it all. He's been at Medallia. He's been at Forsta, customer experience platforms, VOC platforms. But he's also now at Parcel Lab, driving the customer experience forward. And today we're going to dig into the CX goldmine that actually all the retail and e-commerce players have, the post-purchase experience. So it will be great, especially if you are in retail and in e-commerce. But most companies benefit from having a performance-based experience system. That's what Zack is building out and known for. So Zack, thank you for joining me live here today.
Yes, thanks, Jochem. Man, what an incredible group of journey designers that you got online too. It's great to be here. I think the other piece too, Jochem, is although I've spent the last, call it almost 8 years on the tech side, my first 15 years I actually spent in retail. So I held many different roles, from a store manager to a multi-unit leader, to VP of operations, where I had about 120 stores. And then if I think about kind of shifting from retail store operations into, helping the team at Aaron's turn Aaron's.com from like an online catalog to the first transactional rent-to-own website in the United States. And so ultimately after that, progressing into leading the entire CX strategy. And, I've always kind of just discussed the post-purchase experience is always the most neglected, but it's also the biggest black hole. And the reason for it is, even when I was a practitioner, when a customer decided to maybe rent to own a TV, we didn't know when the delivery date was. So typically, a lot of our deliveries were just scheduled, believe it or not, at this time, they were scheduled on paper and pencil. And so I had to try and figure out, okay, when do I send a post-delivery survey to try and collect customer feedback based on what their delivery experience was like? And oftentimes we either send it too early or too late. And so we essentially miss that critical moment. And so ultimately, as I, transitioned and led retail strategy at Medallia and then Forsta, a lot of the retailers were having the exact same challenge. Because if you think about that delivery date that we all look at when we are making a purchase online, a lot of times brands have a very static delivery date. So it might be, hey, your delivery is going to be to you in 3 to 5 days. And so that CX team is still trying to make that best guess. Well, when do I trigger and send that survey? And so ultimately, if we think about the level of insights post delivery, very, very, very minimal.
Right. And this is what a lot of companies struggle with. So we're going to dig into exactly this today. I have many questions and I want to follow up right away, but I won't because few things for housekeeping before we do it. So I've asked Zack to also share a little bit of the wisdom that he just did, also giving a little bit more structure to that. So we're going to go and look at that first. We've played around with a little fun experiment around a fake experience from Tiffany's, which is actually real post-purchase experience. We're going to play around with that and have you as the expert problem solve that with me so we can do that live. But I think the best thing why I wanted you here is that you have a very practical approach of making a customer experience business case, right? To really understand like where's the friction and how do we bring that back to our teams, to our leadership, to our company to address the issues, but not do it once, but do it systemically. And that framework I want to end with today, and we're going to give it to all of the folks listening. So if you are here and have a question for Zack, for me, for us, use the chat. Our team is there as well. They will triage so that we get like a nice list of all the questions that you're asking. We'll do some live. We'll do some at the end. But again, that's the benefit of doing live webinars, that we can actually like interact with all of you at home, at the office, that are tuning in. So please do that. No question is dumb. No question is too big. But maybe we have too many. That's the only problem we can have. So with that, Zack, do you want to take the screen
Yeah.
and show a bit of your experience and set the stage for us in the next like 10 or 15 minutes?
Yeah, absolutely. And someone's driving for me. This is great. I'd also say for me, there's no question off limits either. So give us some hard ones. I love the challenging ones. But ultimately, what I wanted to really kind of set the stage with is, for a lot of us, what we're really trying to understand is, how do we build end-to-end customer journeys that ultimately meet customer expectations, that for our brand. If you're in retail, it grows customer lifetime revenue. If you're in financial services, ultimately you're trying to get assets under management. And so I've taken this, like, I'm a pretty nerdy guy. I love listening to earnings calls from retailers. And one of that is, I just want to hear kind of that emotion from the CEO and the CFO as they're talking about their current results and then their outlook for the future. And so over the last couple of weeks, I've really been diving into basically the top 50 retailers globally that are publicly traded. And what I really was trying to look for was, what are their CEOs talking about? How are they thinking about the customer behavior? And so what you're seeing here is something that's really obvious, but it's often ignored, that as consumers, our behavior is not evolving. It's actually accelerating. And if you think about kind of the last 4 years, especially coming out of the pandemic, we've actually seen the fastest shift in consumer behavior in retail history. So if you think about it, from discovery to delivery, customers used to think about personalization, instant, and seamless as nice to haves. But ultimately, as brands like Amazon, for example, and now Walmart, as they've really started to perfect that post-purchase experience, now personalization, instant, and seamless are all just baseline expectations. And so when you think about kind of where we are, where those are baseline expectations, but then we also think about, what are the expectations in the future, and how is behavior evolving, with really starting to explore AI, and if we think about agentic AI in the future, that's here, but it's going to really evolve in the future. Most brands are trying to keep up with 2025, 2026 expectations, but yet they're still using like a 2021 playbook. And so ultimately, what I think about is that's not a gap that brands are operating in, that's a crash. And we're actually seeing the impact of that crash right now. And so ultimately, when you think about kind of that crash that's happening, well, where it's showing up the most is in the P&L, right? So customer lifetime value has significantly declined because what customers are saying, and we're feeling it, is everything seems very transactional and not relational. And if you want to like get a sense of transactional, just open up your email address. Some of us probably have an email address that we created that all the retailers just send their emails to. But just then search just for one of the brands that you most recently purchased from and look through those emails. How many emails are they sending? Are they personalized or are they just very transactional? If we think about every single brand out of these top 50 that I listen to, every single one of them still has e-commerce as their number one growth driver. And so if you think about the millions of dollars that CMOs are pouring in to driving traffic to their online digital stores, their website, and then driving them to conversion, well, what's also happening is the percentage of lapsed digital customers, especially first-time customers, are on the rise. And so some of these retailers even reported out, and some of the retailers that I've been working with, the percentage of first-time customers that you just spent millions of dollars acquiring, north of 70% haven't made a repeat purchase. And a lot of that just has to do with the experience that the brand is owning is so focused on pre-acquisition and acquisition, the experience essentially ends at the buy button. And then two more things. If we think about post-return repurchase rates, Jochem, they're crashing because brands see returns as a cost. And so a lot of the return strategies are built around return deflection, where it's almost make it as hard as possible to return to where the customer just ends up keeping it, instead of really thinking about it as, hey, how do we leverage returns as the next trigger for growth? And then ultimately, what we are seeing, what we're going to see in some of the data that you've pulled in, is customer satisfaction continues to bottom out because, quite frankly, our behavior is accelerated faster than our technology systems and even our own internal systems and the way in which we work aren't built to handle that. And so when we think about kind of the business impact, I don't think of these as just like lead indicators or lagging indicators. I think about each and every one of these being profit leaks. And most of these profit leaks are actually happening in that post-purchase experience. And so when you think about kind of the post-purchase experience and why a lot of the profit leaks are happening there is essentially most brands treat the post-purchase like a handoff. So many of you, you may have seen like a track and field event. One of my favorite events to watch is the 4x100 relay, where for the men and the women, they had the four fastest, especially around the Olympics time, when they had the four fastest athletes in the race. And so essentially, they're all crushing their 100 meters. But what it ultimately comes down to as well, especially for like those top three teams, is the passing of the baton, that baton exchange. And so the relay teams that really nail that baton exchange, it's so seamless. The sprinter doesn't have to slow down. It's just much in unison. But what happens in retail is the baton just continues to get handed off. And quite frankly, each of the teams, like operations, logistics, support, they're all just kind of operating in their own silo. And then if we think about it, marketing's already checked out. CX is trying to figure out, how do I engage in the post-purchase experience? And then when something breaks, instead of slowing down, they actually have to stop. So like when a return goes wrong or a delivery is delayed, no one really sees the entire pain chain or that specific journey. And so ultimately, Jochem, hope becomes like the strategy. And I don't know about you, but in retail, when hope is your strategy, you can kiss your profit goodbye. And so a lot of folks continuously ask me, well, what are some of the top brands doing? What are some of the brands, the most iconic brands who've actually nailed the post-purchase experience? What are they doing differently? And so the brands that are winning, they don't pass the baton. They operate in these cross-functional experience pods where CX, ops, logistics, tech, everyone works together around a specific journey and a specific goal. So think of this as, if we have 5 different customer cohort segments that our business is really focused on, you would have a cross-functional experience pod for each one of those cohorts where you're essentially responsible for acquisition to repurchase. And that's how they're shifting kind of that post-purchase experience from a cost center to more of a strategic growth lever. And that's how they're reducing where's my order calls. That's how they're driving repeat purchases. That's how they're building loyalty while customers are still kind of waiting to receive their package. And that's kind of their biggest differentiator, is where most brands go dark. These brands are winning customer loyalty. And so I'll finish up here before we get into the data dive. But ultimately, if you think about kind of the entire kind of end-to-end customer journey, that really is the missing link in the post-purchase experience, because a lot of the frictions that could happen in that post-purchase experience, a lot of those are in actually the purchase experience. So not just the delivery date where all the communications get triggered, but ultimately, if you look at, for example, the top 5 reasons why things get returned. So it was the wrong fit, it was the wrong size. And so how effective is your PDP around communicating size and fit, especially if you have a unique size and fit? And so the leading brands are really kind of focused on 4 key things in order to really unlock customer lifetime value. And a lot of this is, you can't operate in these specific experience pods without a shared map. You cannot work in silos. You have to work in unison. And so ultimately, the end-to-end customer journey becomes the playbook. So it's how these brands stop reacting and they really start coordinating. It's how it's how they see friction before it even becomes a fire. It's how they really align strategy, execution, and measurement around these top experience moments that matter. And so journey mapping and journey management, it's not a theory, it's the playbook that just gets executed at an extremely high level that delivers customer lifetime value. So these 4 things they do really, really well, they map the journey end to end. So it starts in pre-purchase all the way to repurchase. They prioritize the business impact. So they're connecting frictions to KPIs like lifetime value, customer acquisition costs, customer retention, because they want to make sure, if you really think about it, they're working on the things that matter the most. And so they're also kind of value stacking short-term and long-term wins. And the reason why they do that is our executive teams, they don't want to just wait for 12, 18 months to see a return on their investment. If you start stacking these small wins, even if they're 6-figure redesigns that are having a 6-figure impact on the P&L, as you start stacking these, now you're starting to stack $1 million in business impact, multiple 6 figures, 7 figures. And most importantly, though, when you think about what these experience pods do, they create real-time action loops. So they're monitoring every impact of an experience redesign, a friction fix, so they can see what's the impact. And if it's not having impact that they thought it would, Jochem, then they ultimately think about how do we redesign this? And so this is how the leading brands are winning in the post-purchase experience, because they're working cross-functionally on one specific customer cohort, and they're responsible for delivering P&L impact, not just CSAT or NPS.
I love that. Thank you, Zach. I think I wanted to interject with many questions, but I wanted to let you riff a little bit. So let's do a few. I mean, people
Yeah.
also ask questions in the chat, but what I love is your analogy on the handing off the baton, right? If you say your pain chain, I mean, journey is a nicer way of framing it, but it's basically the pain chain. So what is the equivalent, right? The journey pod is the equivalent of handing off the baton, because there's not necessarily a handoff anymore. But in fragmented organizations where there is a lot of like us versus them, and there is a lot of like this happening, like what is the equivalent of handing off the baton to actually get this in motion? Like, how would you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, if you think about internally how your organization is already operating, I learned this several years ago when I was at Aaron's. Our organization was already operating at these experience pods. It was our e-commerce team and our technology teams who were essentially, most of the time, we're sprinting 2 to 4 weeks at a time. And so they had this agile experience pod where, based on those specific goals or frictions that they were trying to achieve from the Aaron's website, they essentially already built these experience pods that work together on one common goal every 2 weeks, right? They were sprinting on it. And then they had a sprint review where it was, okay, let's review everything we just did in 2 weeks. And then we start to look at measuring the impact. And then quarterly, when we had our sprint prioritization, where all the executives would actually come, where CX leaders would die to have some type of exposure like that. Then they did that holistic kind of quarterly readout. And so ultimately, what I started to learn as a CX practitioner was a lot of these teams weren't coming with like these massive 7 and 8 figure kind of wins that took, multiple sprints. That experience pod has probably already sprinted on 5 or 6 different things. And if you look at how they stacked all those wins together, they delivered $1 million in impact. And so what I would encourage each and every one to think about is, internally, how's your organization working today? And how do you essentially influence your internal organization that, in order to work cross-functionally, journey management is essentially the playbook that we have to have if we want to not only just deliver the P&L wins, but also do it with operational efficiency so that we maximize profitability.
So how would customer experience team start thinking about the language? Because you mentioned getting closer to the P&L, which
Yeah.
is typically not where customer experience, design, research operates, right? But we want to get closer to that. So language is important. We not necessarily need to understand the P&L end to end or like completely to start making that impact. But how are you advising people that are doing this? How are you seeing teams actually getting closer to what matters to the business so that we can have an impact?
Yeah. So I would say the first place that you could just start is really understand what's the 3 to 5 most strategic initiatives of your organization this year. And ultimately, they'll have something operating around probably grow revenue, reduce customer churn, increase profitability, probably something around data security and privacy in there. If I had to guess, we'll put a boring one in there. But as a CX practitioner, what you have to understand, or if you're building journeys, you're a journey designer, I would say 80 to 90% of everything that gets prioritized or funded has to do with those 3 to 5 things. Because ultimately, those are the big bets that your CEO, she has committed not only to the executive leadership team, but she was just also on an earnings call painting the future of the outlook of your organization. And these are the 3 to 5 things that she truly believed is going to carry the organization there. And so a lot of times what happens is, to your point around language, we show up and we speak voice of customer. So we talk about our net promoter score, we talk about CSAT, we might talk about text analytics and some themes, but ultimately your executive leadership team and most of your cross-functional colleagues or department leaders, like your VPs, they don't understand it. Yes, they might know what it is, but they don't understand it. So it is your responsibility to connect the dots between what your customers are telling us and the impact that it has on the P&L. And so ultimately, you have to understand those KPIs that, like in my case, for our VP of e-commerce, I had to understand the core KPIs that Manjush cared the most about. And then ultimately, I had to go back and look at my voice of customer feedback and say, okay, here are the frictions across the e-commerce end-to-end journey that's impacting those specific KPIs. And then I had to sit down and have this discovery conversation around, and also influencing, and I even say selling as a CX person, to get Manjush to actually care about those, where it's now his idea that we've got to fix and redesign those frictions so that he can achieve what he's on the hook for, what he's accountable for.
Right. And this is a very important point. And also what you did is listen to earnings calls. It's easy to transcribe them, analyze them with the help of a little GPT today to really get to the bottom of things. But that's something everyone can do and should do. Like what's going on in my role, how are the big companies talking about this, and then specifically about the points in the experience or the points in their financial returns that tie back to experience. So I think that's a wonderful example. For people who don't know, check out some of your latest posts that were around this. So lots of good data there. The other point around customer lifetime value, and then there's a question around data, but I'll get to that in a second. I think Kaika, I hope I say your name right, points it out. And I think that's also a hot potato in a room. Are loyalty programs dead? Is that not a thing anymore?
Oh,
Should we think about it?
I love that question. Let me answer that question first, Kaika, and then we'll come back, Jochem, to yours. I wrote a newsletter on this maybe a couple of months ago, but yes, traditional loyalty programs are dead. And here's the reason. If we really think about why loyalty programs were initially created, they really weren't created to reward the customer. They were created so that we could understand who our customers are as a retail brand, right? If you think about when loyalty programs were created in the early 90s and late 90s and early 2000s, we didn't have a lot of the e-commerce traffic that we had. We had customers who just flooded our stores. And so we wanted to understand who each and every person was, and we wanted to collect their information so that we can continuously market to them with direct mail pieces. And so ultimately, we created these loyalty programs where we essentially traded, something for your data. It was loyalty programs are data acquisition engines skinned with a loyalty program of, I want to reward you with something. Now, if we think about the impact, we're still running the same exact loyalty programs, but consumer behavior and our expectations has significantly shifted. And quite frankly, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get us to increase our spend so that I get free shipping. And so I think loyalty tactics are just stale. I think they're dusty. If you actually think about and look at the data around loyalty programs, the level of engagement around it has significantly died. It's almost zero. And so it's how do we really redefine what loyalty is? what our customer expectations are around loyalty, and then how do we deliver that. So that's how I'd say loyalty programs. Look, I think we all want to feel like we're a part of something, like a community or something bigger. But also at the same time, I don't want a loyalty program that's just trying to get me to spend more. I want a loyalty program that's going to add value to my life, not take value out of my checking account. And then I'm going to go back and answer your question. If we think about kind of the end-to-end journey and the P&L impact and customer lifetime value, ultimately from a post-purchase experience, what I say a lot of times is the last mile is the most important mile, especially when it comes to customer lifetime value. And so ultimately, if you think about kind of that post-buy, right now I just hit buy, and you look at that experience from when whatever I bought is fulfilled to when it's shipped to me to when I receive it, there's still so many brands that don't own that last mile experience. So they own the acquisition piece, they own the pre-acquisition piece, and you feel a lot of that brand ownership. But then when it comes to the post-purchase experience, they don't own that last mile. They allow a third-party delivery company to own that last mile. And quite frankly, I hate to say it, but FedEx doesn't care in the States about this brand's essentially customer lifetime value. And so ultimately the best brands, they truly own what that post-purchase experience looked like. They take control of the communications. They leverage that to stay connected to the customer. Their branding, so they own the entire brand experience. And the reason why they do that is they want to make sure that that last impression is they're actually owning it.
So let's talk about actually owning it, right? JourneyPod's running this as well. Tracy has a good question, and I think that's a nice segue into the next bit of this. So how do we determine the experience impact? Is there something scientific, or is this based on customer reviews and surveys? And I think what she's actually asking, but I might be wrong, is that your point is that if we're sending out that post-purchase survey at the wrong time because it's sent by a team that's totally disconnected by the actual delivery date and it's too early or way too late, the feedback is not accurate, if given at all. So we can't rely only on that data. So when we were prepping for today, we created a fun exercise together on like, let's look at a purchase experience journey and let's do a few problem solving live as we go and have you be the expert and me asking you questions. So we put it up the screen and then I look at Tiffany's as our example. Again, like these data are scraped from the web. They are coming from a synthetic data set. So again, not representing Tiffany, but many of us know Tiffany as the brand. And when we look at their entire like omni-channel purchase experience, there would be many journeys in there. But to simplify it, like when people actually make the purchase, then to your point, they hit buy, like the post-purchase experience, which sits here, actually starts. So I'm going to go in there and we're going to add some data and then we're going to have fun. Okay. So I prepped this a little bit. There is like this typical, like get the order confirmation all the way to like returning items, perhaps. But I think while I'll add some data and answer Tracy's question, two metrics came up earlier. It's like, what is the time to repeat purchase? Can you speak a little bit about that? Well, I am going to like add some data to it based on some data sets. Like, why is this such an important metric, maybe more important than lifetime value? And why are brands so focused on this in the post-purchase experience?
Yeah. So if you think about customer lifetime value, that's essentially that long-term, it really is your loyalty metric, right? So that's more of a long-term lagging indicator. And so essentially, if you think about customer lifetime value, a very simple formula to that is how often is a customer purchasing and how much, and the average order value of what their purchases are. If we really kind of break that down, ultimately what brands are trying to do is they're trying to increase the purchase velocity of a customer, and then what their cart size is in order to increase their customer lifetime value. The other reason why customer lifetime value is so important is the profitability of that customer is significantly higher because you're not essentially paying to reacquire them every single time you want them to make a purchase. They're making purchases because they have a really great experience with your brand. And so ultimately that the time to next purchase is so important, because ultimately what we've seen, and I've worked with hundreds of retail brands, is the second purchase is a really good leading indicator on the overall experience that your brand delivered.
Right.
Because they had a good experience, because it met or exceeded expectations, they're going to make a purchase again, especially if that's the first time with your brand. You've fulfilled their needs. Maybe you've built an emotional connection with them while they were shopping in your store. And so ultimately, retail brands look at the time between when I made my first purchase and when I make that next purchase as a really key leading indicator of the entire end-to-end experience of how well did we meet or exceed customer expectations.
Right. Okay, so this is the quantitative part, how we measure this and how we're actually trying to improve this. So in our data hub, like we have feedback from purchases, so literally returns feedback, but we also have CSAT and NPS surveys, we have customer interviews, we have some data from YouTube reviews, like we have a lot of different data. And I think what's cool to see, to answer also Tracy's question, is that when we're looking at specifically the post-purchase experience, those signals of like where the pain is, the pain chain in your words, not necessarily only are captured in the post-purchase survey, right? So I'm gonna look for well, let's look for any basic insight in the last 90 days that are coming through from our data. And I think this is where it gets scientific in terms of volume of data, that we can have statistically significant insights that are coming through the different channels that we're collecting feedback and data from our customers to actually start looking at that impact. So while that is actually running, I'm going to go with a nice question from Caroline, okay, for you to answer. So she says, for me, amazing CX is having no tickets in the inbox because customers have no issues, okay? So how do you recommend balancing customer experience role in putting out fires versus trying to be proactive and work ahead by partnering with teams that anticipate customer needs and solve issues before they happen?
Caroline, this is an amazing question. I love the overall philosophy of having no tickets in the inbox for me to go put out the fire. Like I love that. That's one of the things that my team was kind of ambitious about as well. And what I would say is CX today is extremely reactive. And we're very reactive with putting out those specific fires. I think just to get really tactical for a minute, in order for us to be more proactive than reactive, to where we're spending most of our time influencing our cross-functional peers, is you actually have to get one internally, you have to shift the mindset of what CX is. There's this misunderstanding that customer experience is essentially survey management and report management, where we're going to turn out a quarterly PowerPoint of our NPS and our CSAT and all the key drivers that are impacting our NPS and CSAT. And so that's why we get in this reactive mode. That's why we're seen as a cost center. And what I would say is, now that we have all this incredible technology, especially what we're seeing now, where it's mining for themes, and quite frankly, I don't have to leverage a text analytics engine now with all the summarizations and everything that we're seeing. Ultimately, my role, I should be spending 90% of my time influencing my cross-functional team. And so first and foremost, Caroline, it's a mindset shift that we have to have about what CX is versus where we're operating today. And then the second piece of that is, internally, we have to make sure that we organize our teams to be proactive. Teams are organized today to be reactive. And so we have to organize teams to be more proactive. So those are the first two steps that I would say, this is how you've got to take the shift from being reactive and firefighting to proactive and influencing your organization. And then the percentage of time, I would say 80% plus of your time should be with your cross-functional peers.
Such an important point to really go from like reactive, looking backwards, to proactive and actually start to influence, and therefore looking forward, right? And I think that's the key word here, starting to look forward, not necessarily predictive, but looking forward on like, what can we do together? So while you were saying that, the post-purchase experience frame that we're having here, like the context of the journey, I think that's also the key thing to share among your team, right? It's not about, okay, you are handling the order confirmation piece, but we're together actually in this, right? If we now look at the results on what our data is telling us, okay, so product delivery delay, and there you go, that was hiding in our data. I think that's a very clear one where we have a lot of evidence. It's almost getting scientific here, Tracy. I hope you like this. It's like we get all these like different pieces of feedback from our customers on issues around the waiting and checking the status of the order, right? So how will we go about this, Zach? We're trying to have a better time to repeat purchase. We know we have product delivery delays. That's now confirmed by our data. So what are we supposed to do next from here?
Yeah. So ultimately, I think the first piece is really just understanding what her expectation is when she's ordering from Tiffany. And so I know that I've ordered from Tiffany before. And so if you think about kind of that luxury experience from Tiffany, what you expect in the store with the presentation, with the unboxing experience that you get, ultimately now we have to figure out, one, how do we redesign that when we are not in control of it? And so ultimately what I saw in this journey and this data here is Tiffany's using what I call a static estimated delivery date. So on the website, it says, hey, you will receive your order within 3 to 5 days, where a very dynamic estimated delivery date would essentially say you're getting it on this date. So if you're in the States or you leverage Amazon, Amazon will tell you exactly when you're going to get the package. And so first and foremost, when we start to see a lot of these late deliveries, the first thing that this is signaling to me is that in my tech stack, I may not be getting live updates from logistics. So carrier data is out there. You can, you can scrape the data. You can start to anticipate if deliveries are being delayed. And so now I can be proactive. If I start to see a bunch of deliveries showing up delayed, now you can trigger a delay notification to her to say, hey, we've noticed that there's a delay with the delivery carrier. Now the delivery date expectation has shifted by whatever it may be. So that's the first thing, is really around just proactive communication based on what you're seeing in the carrier data. So that's the first thing. What I've always said is, if someone has to go look for that email to check their delivery status, or call into the contact center, which is where's my order, the Wizmo, then you're not proactively communicating. So that's the first kind of rule. The other piece here that I noticed is, in the customer journey, it looks like they only leveraged your order has been shipped and your order has been delivered. And so ultimately thinking about, how do we, for example, create that customer connection throughout that post-purchase experience? And so if I'm Tiffany and Company, for example, what I may do is I'm going to be thinking about this as, how can I engage her on how to take care of the product? So I might be sending out an email that now has product care instructions. If I ordered the warranty or the product insurance, I'm also updating her on, if you do have an incident, here's exactly the steps on how to file a claim. What I also may be doing is if she ordered the earrings, I may even be showing her now, hey, complete the entire set. And that's how brands are driving that next purchase before the product is even delivered. Or what the top brands are is they're looking at all the behavioral data. So they're looking at what's everything that she browsed online on our website or in our app. And now they're really driving product recommendations based on her behavior and what she looked at, not on this like kind of high level product recommendation based on a SKU.
So these are like specific things for the customer, which are fantastic. And now let's talk a little bit about the organization itself. Okay, so let's say product delivery delay is actually caused by something more systemic, right? Because systems and teams are disconnected, and there needs to be like something way bigger in terms of like a more strategic opportunity here to like address the data disconnect, right? So there's something here that we need to address bigger. So for the last bit of today, Zach, how do we tie this, not necessarily to like small improvements, removing friction in the actual customer experience for her, but how do we tie it back to the business? So, and I want you to talk a little bit about the link between the bigger initiatives, the 5 strategic initiatives that are running in the company, and tying it to the P&L. And I know you have work for that, but maybe can you bring us to how you would actually get this on the attention, or get this to the attention to the right people, to get funding, resources, budget unlocked to start driving the systemic issue here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not for sure who's driving the slide, but if you could pull up that last slide, I think it's slide 6. But ultimately, if we think about the time to repeat purchase, right? Delivery delays has a significant impact, especially when I think about, I just ordered from Tiffany&Co. It was probably really expensive. I may be purchasing because I have a special event coming up. So there's a lot of emotion tied to this specific purchase. And if delivery delays continuously create negative impact on my emotions, because I'm going through this roller coaster of, am I going to get this in time to wear to a friend's wedding this weekend, for example, that has a significant impact on, will I repeat purchase, which ultimately has the impact of kind of customer growth. And so ultimately, I love a game of Mad Libs. Here in the States, you probably know what I'm talking about. In elementary school, we played Mad Libs. For those of you in Europe, you may not know what Mad Libs is, but I had a teacher who used to always play Mad Libs, where she would go around the room and she had this story framed up, and she would go to each student and say, okay, give me an adjective or give me a verb. And so everyone would kind of give her a specific word, and then she would read the story out afterwards. And it was really just a really funny exercise. But ultimately, kind of that game of Mad Libs has just stuck with me throughout my career. And so ultimately created this problem framework around, how do I connect the dots between the frictions and the customer feedback that we're seeing throughout the post-purchase experience and how it's impacting the P&L. So if you look up at the very top, every frequency, so think of this as every month, at least 2,700 customers of ours are experiencing delivery delays, resulting in, and now here's where you're going to measure the impact. So that could be resulting in calls into the customer, calls in the contact center. So resulting in 2,700 Wismo calls or more. This leads to, so if you think about what's the impact that that's leading to, this leads to an operational cost of, let's say it's $5 per call. Now I have 2,700 calls coming in. Think about the impact of that operations expense. Now, this is where I want to link it to one of those higher priority initiatives. So let's say, for example, one of the initiatives in the organization is to reduce operational cost or efficiency cost by X millions of dollars. So this very last sentence, what I'm going to put in here is, if the delivery delay issues are not resolved by end of Q2, we risk achieving our operational efficiency goal by X million dollars. So not only am I framing up the problem of the frictions that I'm seeing throughout the customer journey, I'm linking it to one of those strategic initiatives, and I'm also framing the impact of if we don't prioritize this as an organization, that an experience pod should work on to resolve.
I think this is such a fantastic framing, especially for people in customer experience and design, to really quantify the impact of the issue. Right? To really think about like, hey, can be wrong, can be right in terms of the actual impact, but at least people pay attention. And from here, we'll have a conversation around it.
Yep.
It's bigger, it's smaller. We don't think it's more important than that thing, or it's actually more important than that thing. That is actually what you want to create with this, right? You don't have to be perfectly right, but you want to have the right conversation with the right people about the problem that you are seeing so clearly. Is that a good way
Yeah.
of saying it?
Yeah. So ultimately, I've become the translator here, right? So instead of me showing up and saying, hey, look, I have 2,700 customers that experience delivery delays, and it's impacted our net promoter score by a -4 points. We need to do something about it. Like, I've shown up that way to prioritization meetings, and they're like, that's great, but so what? And so ultimately, it's not that you care less about your customer by putting this in terms of business impact. You're connecting the dots between what your executive team cares about, which is the P&L. And if we redesign these specific frictions, or we redesign the experience and we create a better one, the positive impact that we can have, versus right now, we're kind of heading towards a train wreck, and we're going to miss our operational efficiency goal. Now, I think, Jochem, to go back and answer who's the other kind of part two, I can't remember whose question it was, but how do we kind of connect the dots of the actions that we've taken? Now, if you think about this Mad Libs, I've also created another framework where on a readout, you can say, hey, look, this experience pod took this action. So we redesigned the communication journey, resulting in a decrease of, call it 1,100 Wismo calls, which created an operational efficiency of $550,000 if each call cost $5. So that's how now you would report out on, hey, here's the insight that we had, what we saw. Here's the action that this journey pod took. And here's the impact. And it's got to be causation. It can't be, if you're showing up with correlation, you'll get laughed out of the room. You have to show up with causation of, this is the impact that was generated based on this specific action that we took.
How are we, I'm going to take some questions from the audience that tie into this, and then we have some unrelated ones, which I also want to tackle as they're asking us. But in terms of, this is more of a strategic initiative that will require some people to really take attention or pay attention and actually do something. But there's also the tactical things that we can do, right? So what percentage, if we can have a percentage, do you recommend devoting on strategically solving versus fixing practically?
That's a really good, that's a good one. I'm glad someone brought the tough one. To me, I think it depends on two things. And I'm thinking of in terms of an executive mindset here around prioritization, tactical versus more strategic. If it's more strategic, what executives are going to be thinking about is, what's the business impact? How long is it going to take us to achieve it? And what's the investment I have to make in order for me to potentially achieve this? So those three things is what they're thinking about, like resource allocation. Are there things that I have to reprioritize in order to get the right experience pod working on that most strategic thing? What I can tell you is if it has a significant business impact, it'll get prioritized. One of the reasons why I encourage a lot of CX practitioners to be thinking about some of these smaller wins is when you start to value stack these smaller wins that might be a couple $100,000 or maybe a shorter million, is CEOs right now are fighting quarter to quarter to keep their jobs. I mean, I'm just going to be frank. And so ultimately, when you show up and say, hey, look, here's 5 kind of tactical frictions that we're seeing in the customer journey. If we prioritize all 5 of them, we actually believe it will have a P&L impact of $3.6 million. That's significant in this quarter that can get delivered that they would actually be able to report out on. So you also have to be thinking about where's the mindset of the executive leadership team. How can I deliver some of these singles and doubles? Now I'm doing a baseball analogy. The smaller wins that help them win quarter to quarter while also thinking about this longer term strategic impact.
Right. I think that framing was well received. I'm gonna take a tactical question and a little spin on it. So Liz asked, like, how would you fit the cancellation experience into what we saw on the screen, which was the post-purchase experience, since this is an exception path? And I think like the tactical answer is like you can think of it as a micro journey, right? People will go through that experience if they cancel. But I think the underlying question would be, would we also have a journey pot for cancellations? Is that part of the post-purchase experience? Like, how should we think about that?
Yeah, that's so interesting. The way that I've seen this most effective is journey pods are essentially set up around customer cohorts, essentially, right? Now, let's say, for example, though, your business has seen a tremendous amount of cancellations that is resulting in maybe some product shrinkage because the cancellation's happening after it's been shipped, but there's no recollection of it. So it's resulting in a lot of product shrinkage. So it's having an impact, material impact on EBITDA. Or there's just a tremendous amount of cancellations that's also impacting the repeat purchase. So you're starting to see lifetime value decline. You're seeing the number of customers in your customer file decline. Then you might actually stand up an action pod around this specific micro journey to really understand the why behind the what, and then redesign what's causing that specific cancellation.
Right. So what you're actually saying is the first step to take is not necessarily create a cancellation experience and be part of that regardless, but really dig into like, is it a significant part of the business problem we face today? So we should be intentional about it or not. And if so, then we are actually going to focus on. That's the first step that you're actually recommending people to take.
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, the business is going to prioritize what matters the most to the P&L. And again, it's not that the CEO doesn't care about the customer. She does care about the customer, but she also has a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders to deliver for them as well. And so ultimately, if you frame everything up in terms of the business impact, it'll ultimately help you, 1, get more influence in the organization, and 2, you'll be prioritizing customer frictions that mean the most to the business.
Right. Zack, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm sure there is much more to uncover. We have more questions than time today. If people want to find you, we'll link to the Unpack Your CX resources. And of course, they can find you. Please let us know if this webinar was useful and informative. That will help us also produce better content moving forward. And again, the platform was the new one. So thank you for sticking with us. Hope you like it. Hope it was a better experience for you. Zack, thank you again for being with me today.
Appreciate it. Always a blast.
Yeah, and we're going to do maybe some more of this along the way. So everyone, please let us know what we should have covered but didn't today. And we'll maybe be back with you shortly on more CX gold mining into retail. And for today, enjoy your day, enjoy your evening, and see you again soon on the TheyDo webinars.
Cheers, everyone.